Hello and welcome to this video. Now, today's one is going to now turn to looking at what happened to the League of Nations in the 1930s. We've briefly touched on the League of Nations in the 1930s when we looked at the disarmament conference, but it is a few things that happened in the 1930s that really confirm the failures of the League of Nations, and they really do begin to crumble, and ultimately they've become one of the main causes of the start of World War II. And where we have to start is by looking at what happened in Manchuria, which is in now modern day China. And it is in Manchuria that is the beginning of the end for the League of Nations, really. But before even that, we have to look at something even more important, and we need to look at what happened at the end of the 1920s. Now, first of all, during the 1920s, there was a great amount of prosperity and great amount of democracy around the whole of the world. Countries were doing really well. America especially was doing extremely well. It was the most powerful and richest country in the world at the time. And in fact, America was helping out, as we know from the Dawes Plan, many European countries. And everything seemed stable. Even in Germany, things were greatly improving for a lot of people, and in Japan. And it seemed like everything was going fine. But then all of a sudden, in 1929, which I'm going to just write in blue here, in 1929, right at the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression hit the world. The Wall Street crash occurred, the stock market exchange collapsed in America, and as soon as that collapsed in America, America had to recall all of its loans. It didn't have enough money to support its country. There were millions became unemployed, and due to that there was a huge amount of homelessness and hunger and desperation. And because this happened in America, it affected pretty much the rest of the world as well. And in key countries it had been supporting, so for example in Germany, was flung into huge amounts of chaos. And therefore during the 1930s, instead of prosperity and democracy, two other things start to appear. And as soon as the Wall Street crash happens, the Great Depression happens, instead of prosperity there becomes despair. Everybody's desperate and afraid of the future, and instead of democracy, a lot of countries turn to fascism, which is a right-wing ideology. And many of the countries that turned to fascism actually chose to turn to this right-wing ideology, and one of the main beliefs of fascism is the survival of the strongest by an increase in empire. So there was this belief that the only way they were going to survive the Great Depression now was to increase their territory in around their neighbouring countries. And this is one of the main things that Hitler takes on in the 1930s. But we're not going to look at Germany quite yet. We're going to have to look at one other country. And one other country that had the same ideology, the kind of fascist ideology of that the survival of the strongest by increase in empire, was Japan. Now, Japan had been doing very well in the 1920s, but as soon as the Great Depression happened, like America, and Germany, it became extremely desperate, and there was a lot of homelessness and a lot of unemployment. The silk industry just collapsed, and one of the ways that many people thought that we'd fix this is by increasing their empire. And one of the first places they looked was to this place, which I've already underlined in red, but I'm going to circle it now, Manchuria. Manchuria is to the west of Japan on mainland China. And Japan did have some kind of influence in Manchuria at the time. It had a South Manchurian railway going through part of Manchuria, which the Japanese would man and make sure was not destroyed or tampered with. And so we need to look what happened in Manchuria then. Why is it that Manchuria is one of the main causes for the failure of the League of Nations? Now, as I've already said, so if we look at the dispute first, as I've already said, Japan tried to overcome the depression by building up a bigger empire. Felt the only way to get over it was by taking over other lands and taking from it its resources, and therefore improving its economy. And as I've already said, a part of the Japanese army was stationed in Manchuria already. And what they did, not from the not by the agreement by the Japanese government, they went off their own free will and did this. They blew up a part of the Manchurian railway. So they blew up part of the Manchurian railway, Japanese army. And what they did is they said it was a cover-up. They blamed the Chinese. There was a huge amount of tension between Japanese and Chinese, racial tensions in particular, and the Japanese army, who faked this bombing, blamed the Chinese for it. And so the Japanese army, convinced that the only way to stop these Chinese from any more terrorist acts was to invade Manchuria. So they invaded Manchuria in 1932, and they threw out the Chinese and took Manchuria for its own. They even set up their own government there. So they set up their own government, and they called the area now not Manchuria but Manchukuo. So Japan just moved in. It used this excuse of the railway being blown up. Then the rest of the world did genuinely think it was the Chinese that had done it. It wouldn't be for a few years to come until it was revealed that it was actually the rebel Japanese army. But at the time, Japan was saying, right, we're bringing civilization to China. We're basically, in a way, saving it from these terrorists. So China, what they did is they immediately asked the League for help. They asked the League of Nations for help. And now we need to look at, well, what did the League do? Now, the first thing, ultimately, the League should have done is really that Japan should have just been told to get out straight away. It was not legal for them to just go and invade Manchuria and take it. But instead, what happened is that the League sent a group of officials, led by Lord Lytton, to study the problem. And the problem with this is it took a whole year. So Lord Lytton, who went over, an Englishman, he went to study what was going on, what was the problem, why Japan was there, where's Manchuria, why did they take Manchuria, China, was it justified? And this whole report writing took a whole year. And it wasn't until February 1933, so like I've looked up here, 1932 Manchuria was invaded, and not until 1933 was it that the League ordered Japan to leave Manchuria. They told Japan to leave Manchuria. So what happened after that? You'd think that, as many countries had done in the 1920s, that Japan would just leave. They'd listen to the League, but they'd realised that ultimately the League of Nations was powerless, and instead they just refused to leave. Japan refused to leave Manchuria, and to put more salt in the wound, they left the League. And as we remember, Japan was one of the main 4 members of the League of Nations. It was part of the council, so it's a big nation to just basically turn around, stick 2 fingers up to the League of Nations and say, that's it, we're not listening to you, we're gone. Now, one of the main reasons that perhaps the League of Nations took so long to react to the invasion of Manchuria is because they had trading links with Japan. Remember, one of the ways to try and stop country was to put sanctions on Japan, not trade with it any longer. But remember, the Great Depression had just happened, and it was a very difficult time. So the League could never really agree on sanctions. So it sent Lord Lytton to do a report, which took a year. They then couldn't agree on any sanctions, and furthermore, there was an attitude from, Britain and France. They really did not want a war. They did not want to have to get into a war with Japan on the other side of the globe. And ultimately, they had this kind of reaction, which is in a source up here. It's a letter from the Master of Peterhouse, Cambridge University, to his friend John Simon, the British Foreign Secretary. So you've got this guy writing to the British Foreign Secretary in 1933, and he says, I know this sounds all wrong, perhaps immoral, when Japan is flouting the League of Nations, but 1, she was greatly provoked. 2, she must ere long expand somewhere. For goodness sake, let, or rather encourage her to do so there instead of Australia. And 3, her control of Manchuria means a real block against communist aggression. So automatically you should think that the League of Nations should react straight away and stop Japan. But there was a real attitude that was like, well, they were provoked in the first place. I'd rather they expand in a place like Manchuria, where Britain and France don't really care about, instead of, for example, Australia, which obviously Britain had a lot of interest in. And also, in a way, if they let Japan invade Manchuria, well, it does mean a block against communist Russia, as to the north of China is communist Russia. So, ultimately, at the end of the day, the League of Nations had failed. And it had failed because it had took too long to react. Lord Lytton's report took a year to put together, and when they did agree that Japan was in the wrong and that they should leave immediately, Japan just refused to leave and just quite simply left the League of Nations. And they had dawdled on this, especially Britain and France, because they ultimately did not want a war in a place that no one really had much interest in, and they could not agree with any sanctions to put on Japan. As remember, it was the time of the Great Depression when countries were increasingly desperate. And that was the attitude of many governments at the time. But also at the same time, it was attitude from from cartoonists, and you might get a cartoon like this, which is, as we can see, we've got Japan here with its huge cannon. It's being loaded up with bullets by its army, and they have shooting a huge bullet through all of these treaties. Now, I know they're not 100% clear here, but one of them, this one here, says the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and just showing that the attitude by many in this circle was saying Japan were just basically ignoring all of the agreements they'd made in the 1920s. They were just shooting through them, and they were obviously being extremely violent and aggressive, and were looking towards not creating any kind of peace or working with the League of Nations whatsoever. And ultimately, it was this kind of attitude that would prevail in the 1930s.